All right, brother.
No.
I encourage you personally.
Well, we see ultimately in the story God's wisdom in giving the people the king they need. So that just has the implication in our lives in God's wisdom in providing the things we need as well. And so just remember his wisdom over what we think or expect or want.
Good deal. Let's go around this way. Okay.
I was encouraged just by this whole idea of Saul is such a loser in so many ways. Prior to this passage, after, and he's like us, and he's sinful, and yet in this passage, God achieves something great through him, and he does have this righteous indignation there for the disgrace of God's name. So just encouraging that God uses all sorts.
I appreciate it. Thank you for this sermon. I appreciated the whole piece about how God works his salvation, sort of along the lines of what Trevor was mentioning. Given the fact that Saul was hiding in the previous chapter, but when the Spirit of the Lord, when we talked about that piece in verse 6, how the Spirit of the Lord came upon him and God used him in that particular way, that was really encouraging to me to know, despite past failures, what God can do. So thank you for that.
I was encouraged, deeply encouraged by your little lines on how God's salvation turns us from weeping to worship, from danger to deliverance. The great contrast between before God's salvation and after was really edifying.
Yeah, the little bit on anger, just the idea that it's not necessarily a bad thing, although we need to know whether it's a bad thing or not, but that we can have it and it be something that we can use righteously. So, thank you.
I appreciated how you brought the people's plight into it's not just they're in danger, but this is a personal matter for God himself. And he takes a personal stake in his people's plight, and it was a good reminder for me.
Yeah, in a similar way, this idea that we all have desperate situations, and that God is he cares about those desperate situations and sends help, gracious help, even sometimes when we do the wrong thing. But he's a gracious God who does that kind of stuff. It's encouraging.
So what could you have done better? What do you feel didn't quite hit like you anticipated?
I mean, there's a lot. I needed to do more time in the text. I did finish this up at 3 a.m. last night. But I mean, there's just a lot that I wanted to work through just my own self personally. But aside from just more and better prep on my part, even some application, I could have done more. I talked about the righteous anger thing and a little piece of encouragement at the end with Romans 8, but I'm sure there's something else that could be applied from this.
All right.
I enjoyed the sermon, Wes, and I thought you were easy to listen to. One of the things I was thinking from the beginning, and I was wondering if you could get to it, and I think you did a little bit, but maybe not in a way that I fully understood, was just the title with the People's King and how that relates with your main point, only the Lord's King can save. And because I was thinking it's the same guy, and I just couldn't quite figure out the connection there.
Right.
Yeah, I was trying to the people wanted him as king, but ultimately he wasn't God's king. I could have done that better. I was saying, because he turned out to be the people's king. They wanted him. They were wanting to kill people for him. But ultimately, this wasn't the Lord's king. He has a better king.
That's
He,
true.
who brings a better
But the
deliverer.
title's got to be, so your title is like doing the opposite of what your sermon did. Because your sermon did a good job highlighting the goodness of Saul, rightly.
Yeah.
And that title, the way you just explained your title is kind of like diminishing that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you gotta lean
He
into
was
that
God's
here.
king for this
Right.
event.
Yeah.
He was exactly who he was supposed to be.
Okay. Yeah. So
Which your sermon got across.
Yeah.
it was a bad title.
Yeah.
So, so I think the sermon could have been helped in light of what you've already said about more even application, because you on that anchor piece, I thought that was really good, and I was looking for some more at the end. But I think on a more technical note, just to go a different direction, I think you could have, even with the time that you had, and you have plenty of time left, you could have worked on the transitions a little bit better too. Because I thought the transitions were a little bit too jarring as you moved, even from the intro to the body, and then even within, the transitions were just a little bit too abrupt.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was gonna say the same thing. I'll give you one.
Me too.
I'll give you one example, which was good illustration at the beginning with Sandlot, but instead of taking that one extra sentence and connecting like a transition statement of just like in Sandlot when there's this obstacle or whatever, so you too might be facing, you just sort of jump straight into the fact that we too we too have desperate situations. It was like, well, did you just say that to kind of make us laugh a little bit or think about a movie? Like, you could have just had a slightly better intro or a transition statement into actually connecting it to us today. So that's just a subset of what Ed was saying.
And I think if you kept that desperation thing kind of going throughout your sermon, it would have been a little bit easier for you to maybe apply some different things. Because I kind of didn't feel like it was there at all later on, which I was like, oh, but like, what are I can think of some desperate situations I have, but then like, what does it mean that God saves me from those or something like that? So I don't know if maybe continuing that idea along or using that idea to flip things on its head, I don't know, but I think you could wield that better throughout the sermon.
Yeah. This has kind of already been said, but I think in general, like, I could understand the flow of the story pretty well in all the pieces. I think it was hard to see how it was supposed to like land for me now in like my context. I think just a little bit more time on like the application side of things would have helped your sermon out a bit.
Yeah. So, as you think about what to write down on paper, spend more time writing transition stuff than other things. Because, for example, when you got to Jesus, both times it was like, boom, 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 Jesus! And you're like, whoa, hold on, slow down. What you said once you got there was fine about him flipping tables and getting upset. And then also what you talked about when it comes to the actual, what Jesus did for us, is fine. But if you can lose everybody on the way that you work your way in there. Like, why'd you go to Jesus being angry? I don't know. Like, and then, I don't know why I should care. And then, when you got to him as like the better king, it was so brief that it made it sound like Saul's a good dude. And then at the end it's like, never mind, Jesus is great. So it wasn't like this in a similar but even greater way. Because again, it's not about his failings.
Yeah.
Right? But because it just was quick, you lost some of the nuance there.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. And The other thing that I think Jeremy or someone reminded me of lately is after that gospel connection, if you go back to the text, then
Yeah.
it'll help us like understand that the passage is, you know, situated somewhere in the Bible and it's not just about, you know, Jesus. So it helps us appreciate 1 Samuel more than just the present or
Yeah.
the gospel connection.
That's good. And just to work on something technical as it relates to delivery, I thought that, and obviously, you know, you didn't have time to memorize it and all those types of things, but even as you're reading, if you could work on your eye contact, as well as, you know, there's a couple of places where you were using both your hands, but I think for most part you had like one hand in your pocket,
Mhm.
and it sort of it didn't match. What you were saying was good, but I was like, man, does he
Right.
does he really believe it, or is he really engaged in it? And it was like a disconnect. So I think if you could work even on whatever you have before you, sort of figuring out how to get more connected to the audience, even in this small space. And that might mean something as simple as, like you did a couple times toward the end, using both your hands or even holding on to the podium, something that signals something other than I'm just reading off the paper.
Yeah.
So, your main point, obviously true, faithful, simple, a lot of good about it. I think it could have been more specific to this text and maybe slightly more catchy, something, and you could argue to it, so there's a lot of good in terms of your main point, but using your intro language of desperation, and then, you know, it could have been like, only the Lord's King can deliver the desperate, like that, you know, that might have a ring to it that's now burned into someone's memory throughout, a little bit more specific to your text, a little bit more specific to the need here, which you drew out. Like, it's a desperate situation, which is different than a lot of other salvation accounts, you know, in the Bible. So, just a little bit more specific, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Something I've had to start working on a lot more. It's the last thing you kind of think about sometimes. But the conclusion,
Yep.
it was a rough landing. And
Sheesh.
I do the same thing too. So, just, you know, either bringing an idea back or repeating the points, like, with some more, like, applicationary kind of things. That's another word that I just made up.
That's definitely not a word.
This isn't Scrabble. This is
So yeah, just kind of land it pretty well. Like, we heard a sermon that was almost the exact opposite. Like, I was like, "What's going on?" And then the landing was like, "Oh, okay, I get it."
Yeah.
So just endings are important.
Yeah.
I think you're even in like a sermon that's a little bit more like you know, if you want to be more like descriptive and tell the story, I think you can still like help your audience along by like using illustrations to sort of like put us in the shoes of those people a little bit better. You did it really well at the beginning of your sermon with like desperation, and these people were desperate. But in other places in your sermon, I think you could like do other illustrations to just sort of like help us understand how they're feeling, or understand like what's the emotional logic of the text and such.
Yeah, this last one is kind of general. Like, you had 9 minutes, and this would have been a sermon that would have benefited from at least 5 more minutes of, like, so again, slow down even more. It's better, but keep slowing down. And then just like pause, especially when you get to the weird stuff, because you had some great lines about like just observing the weirdness of the text, but you didn't let us think about it.
Yeah.
You just said it and ran.
Dude.
So just like,
You can think of another compliment.
That's all right, I have like 4.
so you just kind of just hit, when you hit something weird, just give us a second to think about it, and then lean into it. That'll give you also the opportunity to think, where am I going after this? Where am I? So everybody wins when you kind of just take, not these awkward pauses where you're just standing there looking at the congregation, but you're just trying to help something land. So it's all on the timing.
Yeah.
So you're much less just like spitting it out, but just work on pauses and stuff, especially when you get to sections like that, because you had a couple sections that were just been like, how crazy is this?
Right, right. So, brother, what did you do well? What was a good feature of the sermon?
Well, since last year, the main thing I'm trying to work on is tone and pace, so I can try to still get better on like letting things sit. But I feel like my tone was different. So, I mean, so hopefully that was well.
Good deal. Joe?
I thought the way that you broke it up and read each section, that worked well for me, because I was kind of into the words that you had just read, and then you were explaining them, and so I like that. The transitions that all these guys don't like, I actually thought they were okay.
You're wrong. Just to be clear, you're wrong.
But maybe you already had your compliment. I think for the average listener, they don't really notice that big eruption. Maybe these guys do, but like guys like me, it's just like, no, it just so it works, man. It works.
You're sitting there with a pen in your hand, rapidly dedicated, knowing you have to give feedback to. You're gonna be a mom with 3 kids. Ain't no way those people are like, I really appreciate that abrupt jump to Jesus attitude.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciated a lot of things, and I'll just pick a couple. I really appreciate the concessions that you made.
Yeah.
It's not your typical Sunday school passage.
Yeah, that was good.
Hey, I'm not a war expert, but
Oh, so good.
Yeah.
that was so.
That was a great line.
That was.
Yeah.
And even it's not a concession, but I thought you set it up. It's a good tool to use, even though it didn't land exactly like you wanted it. And that was when you gave your title. You said, "Well, what does it mean? The People's King. Why would I title that?"
Yeah.
Well, let's see. I'm like, okay, let's see.
Yeah, let's see.
So you've already mentioned it, it's been alluded to by Jeremy, but I want to reemphasize that you made significant improvements with your tone.
Mhm.
It was a lot more enjoyable, like I didn't feel like you were high strung in this one. Like I could relax and listen to you, and it was enjoyable. I enjoy your other sermons, but it was significant improvement. Significant improvement. Yeah.
I thought in the intro you had a good connecting with the Sandlot, and then I especially appreciated how you turned and then made it personal. You gave a personal example of desperation. I thought that was powerful, helpful, helped us all immediately see you for who you are and listen better. So
Right.
Ethos, pathos, you got it all, man.
Your transitions were terrible.
Yeah. Hold on to that. Wait, hold on. You're stealing Nathan's.
no, I already gave mine.
He just
Okay.
went.
Okay.
He was just talking out of
Yeah,
turn.
About
you're
intro.
trying to,
Yeah.
You're trying to step on it. Never mind. Go for it. Yeah.
Cool, good time. The thing is already kind of said, but like I think you did a really good job like pointing out like the textures of the text and like different ironies in the text. It's like, isn't this weird? Isn't that like funny? And like, yeah, I think like if you were just like, if I was just like reading it, I wouldn't like notice it. But the fact that you pointed it out, like, maybe, oh yeah, that is weird. Why did they do that? And then it made the story like come alive to me. So, yeah.
Yeah, I thought what was particularly good about it was how you got out of all of those things. So you used every one that I remember. You kind of like being like, that's kind of weird. So like, for example, you're like, verse 3. It's like, I'm no war expert. Verse 3 doesn't sound real smart. this whole idea of giving them 7 days. And then can you explain why? You didn't just like make me try to figure out why you thought that was interesting. You told me, because like now they got time to go find somebody. It's like, oh, okay. You know, so all these little things, or like, you know, the idea that taking out their right eye's kind of crazy or whatever, but it doesn't just diminish them in battle, but it actually diminishes like their God. Was like, so you used all of those interesting things in ways that made more sense of the story instead of just made us go like, ah, yeah, that's a weird detail.
Yeah.
And then I just like the one line there. You said Saul struck down these people, and Jesus was struck down, and how you kind of again brought about a bit of a mystery there in the gospel, and it points to the beauty of it and the amazingness of it.
So, I think you, let's pick this one. I think that particularly in the first half of the sermon, you did a really good job with some well-placed questions. When you were dealing, I guess in the second movement, about the righteous anger thing, you asked, do the things that make us angry matter to God? And then you went on a little run on that. But before that, there were other questions, other places where you would ask questions that I thought was a good use of a good use of time, a good use of questions to sort of get us either into the text or to make a point of application without having to spend a whole lot of time on it. So I would just encourage you to do that a little bit more, because when you do it, it works well. I think in the beginning you was talking about like when you dealt with a desperate situation. There's a few times you asked questions. Well, what about you? I mean, have you? What about this? Well, I know I've had some desperate situations with finance. Blah, blah, blah. But what about you? And they kept on pulling me in every time you would say it. So I think just keep doing that.
So especially from your last sermon to this one, your sentence formation was a lot better, a lot more variation, and he's alluding to questions. It wasn't the same sort of length sentence every time, a lot more variation, so that was good.
I think the simplicity of your structure helped you, especially at the end. You kind of had those sayings where it's like weeping to worship, where you pointed to the text and you took us from the beginning to the end clearly. So I understood this story very well because of that. So it was just a very good use of those things for us to understand as well.
Again, this has already been said, but I thought like how you just got started with your sermon was like really captivating for all of us, and I thought your intro was great, and like introducing a concept of desperation, and then illustrating it in a fun way, and then turning it in a more personal way, and then doing other things with it. So when you got playful in your applications and stuff like that, I think you did a really good job. So.
Yeah, I thought you did a particularly good job of using the literary context. You did not bring it up at the beginning, you didn't set up the story, you launched right at the story, you held back chapter 10 to the opportune moment to highlight how different this was from what happened in chapter 10, which is a key move. So you brought it in at the right point, you used it for the right length of time, you made more sense of what was going on in the passage, and you moved on. And it was like the ideal use of literary context in a narrative to kind of highlight something crazy that's going on for the purpose of that text.
All right, well, thanks, guys.